back. So we are done with the Carthage part of things, and we have included the RxSwift and RxCoco socket IO Starscream these dependencies in the project right now. So what right now we will do in this bit of episode is we will do that validation of the email as well as the username to enable the login button. And once you hit the login, boom, you're gonna hit the socket server to disconnect that server, and then you will start receiving the socket responses, or even you can send socket requests to the socket server. So that's what you're going to do in the series, or at least in these episodes which we are right now doing. So first thing first, let's do this. We don't have um, we just have a builder right now. We don't have the presenter, router, and all that stuff. So let's quickly create all that whatever is needed. So let's start with the presenter. So this is for the login part. I'm going to create the presenter for the chat room login, because it being its own framework, it's easier to actually create it with the same name. Like everywhere it's called as presenter router builder. So you don't need to actually worry about the naming convention being followed. There will not be any conflict because it is within its own framework. Presenter. So it's going to be the same template. So I'm going to just grab whatever I have, same structure everywhere. So presenter is going to have a presentation implementation. So presentation is going to be more or less similar. So I'll keep that in the view controller. Presenter. So let's keep these things empty, because we don't know what is going to be the input and output. But at least otherwise, this is going to be the structure everywhere. Presentation, input, output, producer, which creates a presenter, and input, output. So I'm gonna just keep this structure, go back and then let's implement this within our presenter. Presentation implements presenter, so it should implement these two things right now, input and output. These are two tuples. If you're not aware of how these works, you need to check back my earlier tutorial where we have the same kind of implementation, pretty much a similar thing, where you have a input and output defined like this, which creates a presenter using a producer, something like this. So you need to maybe refer back an earlier tutorial. I'll provide that link if you don't find it easily. So that's the first part. So again, presenter is going to have the similar kind of init structure. So that will more be like you need to have a use case section where you are going to include all the use cases from your interactor. Don't just gonna keep it empty, type case use case is empty, and then I'm going to have a reference. Let me create a routing, which is more like a protocol for your router. Protocol routing, keep it empty, and I'm going to include a reference of that within your presenter. So that's my routing reference. Also, let's keep a reference of your use cases. I'm just going to call it as use cases, this same use case, just using the same template I have already, because I don't want to spend much time creating this VIPER modules again and again, because it's already discussed in an earlier tutorial. So routing, and then I'm going to have an init where I'm going to pass input, which is nothing but all the inputs which are coming from your view controller. Let's say a tap on a button, if you are making an entry into a text box, all those are inputs to your all those are inputs which are like received using this input tuple, which you have defined right now in your presentation, which is implemented by the presenter. That you can receive. Then you can have the router instance in your presenter, through the routing protocol which we defined. And then we can also have the use cases, which is a use case which we defined here again. So these are the things which are going to come from the builder. So let's wait for that. Input, routing, use case. So from next module onwards, I'm just gonna grab these directly and then reuse it right away. So let me just instantiate all these. Input is going to be our, we don't, you have already defined an input here. So input, self dot input is input. Then self dot router is equal to router. Self dot use case is equal to use cases. So you're just receiving all that. Now it should not give you any kind of error. So we also need to define a router which will implement this routing protocol. Router within your chat room login, and let's include UI kit because router needs your view controller's reference. So class router init using view controller because it's going to receive the created view controller, because router is what does all your transition from one screen to the other, navigation and everything. So it needs a reference of your view controller. Private weak where it needs to have a weak reference of your view controller, otherwise it will lead to memory leak. UI view controller. So I can say view controller, view controller. So that's my router. It should also implement the routing which we created. Router routing. So we don't have any routes defined yet, no functions defined yet. So that's fine, but we can take it up later. So that's done. So router, presenter, two things done. Now we also need to have the output defined, but we can come to that in a bit. Maybe I can also create that. Let's define a function for output. I'm gonna create an extension for that. Presenter, and it's going to have a function called output, which will accept input. Once we have some input, then it will be used, but right now it's just output, so it should queue back output receiving something. So it does not have anything right now. Maybe make it static, and then let's keep this as a private extension because it's not going to be used anywhere else. So I can also say self dot output is equal to so whatever output we defined here is equal to the presenter dot output function which we defined, which will accept the input. That's done. So input is also defined. Maybe we will also need one function where we are going to do all the processing. We can call it process. That can also be called within the init itself. So that will come later. We don't have any processing yet, but that will happen as soon as you implement all those chat all the service socket IO services. So that can wait, but this is going to be the basic structure of every presenter and router that we are going to define. So I'm just going to reuse these things each and every time I have to create these structures. That's done. So let's go back to our chat view controller itself. This also needs to instantiate. The view controller is the one who will instantiate the presenter's reference. So we need to then include a couple of things. One is a reference of, it needs to keep a private reference of the presenter, which will be through the presentation protocol which we defined here. So everything is going to be referenced to this protocol instead of the direct whole presenter class. And we also need a presenter producer, which is nothing but this producer which we created, which accepts a closure. So once you pass something as an input to that closure, it creates a presenter. So that's what is going to happen. we are keeping an instance of that producer which creates a presenter here, presentation dot producer. That's my presenter. So once this viewed load gets called, this is where I am going to create an instance of presenter. So presenter, I will say create my presenter using the presenter producer, which is actually going to accept an input. So right now input is an empty tuple. So as soon as we start adding some actions to this, let's say if it is on tap of some button, then we will have a driver defined here. So that's what we will keep passing within this once you start using some input actions. So right now this is presenter producer, which creates a presenter instance within the viewDit load. And how do we instantiate, how do we pass these input values to presenter which creates the output? I mean, how are you going to actually set a reference to this producer is what, because we are not setting. Okay, let's do that. So builder view needs to have a reference of presenter. So before that, let's create the presenter. And even before that, let's create the router, because router just needs and reference of your view controller, which is what we created here, view router. And now let's create the what do we need? We need to pass the input for creation of presenter. We are not passing that here. We are just using a we are just calling a closure block. So we need to pass this closure block from the builder, and this closure is what is getting called here by passing the input. Input is accepted when the viewDit load is happening, but we are setting that closures reference of the presenter over here. So let so view is having this presenter producers reference. So we don't actually, if you look at it in the presenter or within the view controller, view this is defined here. The presenter producer is an internal variable and it is accepting this producer. So this acceptance is happening from within the producer, sorry, within the builder. So that's what I'm going to do. It is actually a closure. So input, it is going to accept $0 is the input. So we don't have, actually it will be something like input will be accepted here, and then you're creating the presenter instance here. So presenter will accept an input, which is this input which we defined here, and the routing. So router we already have, which implements routing. So router and the use cases. Right now use cases is empty, so I'm just gonna keep it as an empty tuple like this. So it should not give me an error. So producer presenter producer's instance is created here, and it is accepting an input, router and use case. Input is nothing but whatever you pass over here, like within this closure, whatever you pass is will be accepted within this input, and it will create that. The instance will then have this input. So we can even simplify it. I can say $0, because that is what the $0 variable is, what is the input is. So that's done. Now router, view, presenter, everything is defined, and this whole structure is created. Router, view controller, and the presenter. The whole dependency is created by this builder right now. No much change. It should run as is, like however it was running earlier. Just run it and see, because it can go right now up to the login screen, but there is no validation. That's what we are going to do here, do that validation part. And once the validation is complete, we trigger that login. The image not found, I think it is Rx Coco. So maybe we did something wrong while defining the The bundle, where is that? Oh, I did that Carthage run script within landing. That's a problem. So we need to actually move it to. Can I actually easily move it to? We need to do that whole thing again. So whatever I have done here, actually need to move it to the. That was a pretty dumb mistake. Carthage run script. Whole of that, let's copy paste. Then remove that thing from landing. Is it like so easy? I cannot. I need to do it individually. So, pretty silly mistake here. 5 of them I need. So you guys might have already identified this mistake, and the last episode you'd be like, what is he doing? So that's what it was a mistake from my end. I'm rectifying it right now. That's done. And the output, 5 of them. So you also identified what kind of error it can throw if you set it wrongly. So this is what happens. It will not find that image of that specific framework. So it started with the RX Coco itself, first thing. Do I have the fifth one? So I guess this should be fine. Let me remove this one, which was a mistake. Delete. Yeah, let's run this. I hope it's fine this time. I have this file. Coco Swift relay socket Starscream socket. Starscream relay. Okay, let's run. Go back. Should be fine. Yeah, so okay. Start. So we are at the login screen. We don't. This is where we need to do the validation. It does not do anything. We need to disable this, and once we start entering something here, that's when it needs to start validating whether it's a proper entry or not. So let's do that. Simple thing. All that we need is start including login view controller already has these different definitions or the import. Let's import RxSwift and Rx Coco here, and we already have these email username, email, and login button. So let's include the inputs from there. Those. So what are the inputs that I have defined? Let me just keep that same name. So we need drivers for that. Let's create. So these now we are starting with the RX Swift things. Until now it was pure Swift. This is where now RX Swift kicks in, but then I can explain what is the equivalent of what is going on here. First thing is username. Text field we are grabbing through something called as a driver, which will always run in the main thread. And I'm going to use email as another driver So two drivers we defined. So this is nothing but if you had pure RxSwift, the pure Swift implementation, this will be just that whatever you are entering into text field, like a username or email, those are going to be those values you are going to capture through, let's say, a text did change or something, edit value, edit change. You are just keeping hold of those values within a variable maybe. So in this case, I'm going to use a variable called as username and email, but Rx provides you extensions, Rx extensions, which can easily do it for you through the text property on change. Every change, it is going to trigger an event or a signal so that it will be captured within these variables that you are defining. So implementation wise, that is the only thing. Every time there is a text change within username or email, you are sending a signal using maybe your outlet actions like a text change, and validating that every change, and based on those changes you are either enabling or disabling the login button. So that's the whole thing which needs to happen. So I'm just going to do this using pure RxSwift right now. So user two events. So now I told you, like, this will actually ask now for, because I have defined an input, and input we need to pass for this to create the presenter. So if these are my input values which I have defined right now, which is username, it's a username, that value change is going to come through this username text field. I'm going to convert it into a text property. It's not empty or empty, any value it can accept, and I am directly converted into a driver. That driver is nothing but an observable which will always run in the main thread. So when you create an observable to a driver, it always runs into a main thread and it will never error out. That means this is more used for something very specifically to things which are going to happen in the UI side. So that's what it is. Username and email, these are the two things we defined. So email text field, also the same stuff, text change, even if it is empty, I'm gonna create it as a driver. So that is done. So now driver, whatever I'm passing now will be available within the presenter. So it's more like I have these signals happening within the view controller, I'm sending it to the presenter. That's the only thing we are doing here. So it's available through the input. So we have defined, we have initted it here. So every dependency association is happening within this builder. So view is creating this presenter using this presenter producer. So it's a closure which is accessed from within the view did load. Presenter is created by accepting this value through the closure input. So these are the input values you are passing. So whole dependency is happening here. Presenter gets created over here whenever this presenter produces is accessed. That is happening within this. So that is done, and the value of input is passed to the presenter through the init itself. So even that dependency we are capturing. So now whatever changes which are happening within your view controller, let's say the text change, your email value change, all will be available in this signal. So what are we trying to do now? We are going to validate the username. Anyway, we don't need to validate, we just need to see whether it's not an empty value, otherwise it's fine. But email, it should be a proper valid email. Once those two things are fine, we will enable the button, login button. If those are not valid, we will disable it. That's the whole thing we are going to do. So input is available here, and we need an output. I told we need to define that we need to disable or enable login button. So for that, I am defining a driver again. So output is nothing but whatever is done from the validation or something which is done from the presenter needs to go back to your view controller. So for that, we need an output. So we are keeping everything which need to go back to the view controller within the output. So every validation is going to happen within the presentations output. I'm gonna keep it as a boolean because it's going to validate whether it's in proper value or not. So it's already giving me an error because this is where I'm creating the output. So I need to have an enable login output. I'm just gonna keep it as a never driver, because this never, if I keep it, it's never gonna execute, but then I'm gonna fix it soon. I need to send a proper value right now. So because now this is not a never that enable, we need to associate that. Later we will associate that enable login with the actual login button. So let's define this right now. First thing first, let me go back to the presenter. So I'm gonna combine these two drivers. Driver dot combine latest. I have the input username and input email. These two. I'm just gonna combine these two, but then the combination is not, because I'm gonna combine this, but I'm just going to use their observable values. Right now these observable or the driver values are string. I need to convert them to a boolean so that I can bind it with this enable login, because enable login driver needs to drive using boolean values, true or false, to enable or disable. So for converting those into booleans, I need to map these username values and convert those into boolean values. So for that I'm gonna get the value and then check whether is this value is empty. If not empty means username is valid. If not empty, that becomes true. I also need to validate for email. So email needs to have two kind of validation. One is uh, dot map $0 dot is empty. One validation is if it is not empty. So these two basic validation, maybe I can just show you what happens right now, because these two are the basic validations. Observable is combined right now, email and this one. I can now use this to create a driver. It's already a driver, so all that I need to do is maybe then to create a variable out of it. Let enable login driver, I may call it, and then I can associate it in replacing this and associating this. So basic what is wrong, driver.combine. Okay, these are two values right now. I need to combine them. So for that I need to again map it, because this map, sorry, if you see the map, those are two values. We need to make it as one boolean. Two boolean values are coming and I need to send a result back. So $0 and $1 are the values from username and the email, those two drivers. So I need to see whether $0 and $1 both are true or true or false. Based on that, this will work. So now it should not give me an error because it's already mapped. 0 and 1, both you need to check. This is true as well as this is true. Let's enable the login button. If this is true, this is false, let's not enable the login button. So basic login validation is done. Let's now go back to our view controller and do the binding. So I have the setup UI. I'm gonna again create one more function called setup binding. And already have the presenter's reference within the view controller. We have created it as a private reference. So through the presenter reference, I can always get the output which we defined. Like this is our output. Output has the enable logins or observable value or driver value. Now I can just say, because I know if it's not empty, if value is not empty, it's going to send a value. I can always map it. and maybe you can see can what is going on by putting a debug identifier enable login driver false. Maybe let's just see what goes on. Drive dispose by, we need a dispose bag. I don't think we have it here. Just say call it bag, and let me create that bag. Private let this bag equal to dispose bag. Bag is ready. So this is something which can, as soon as this view controller's job is done, this will deallocate these enable login all these drivers, so it keeps everything within a bag. Once disposed, it will remove it everything from this dispose bag. So let's just see what goes on. We need to also call the setup binding here. So you're not going to see the enable and disable right away, but you'll just at least see this getting printed whenever that happens. Enable and disable, true, false values. So let's run. Keep it at the center. Start. So driver is subscribed. It prints every state it goes through. First it is subscribed, and as soon as it is subscribed, it says false because initial values are sent, which is like empty username and empty password. Those combines and then sees whether those values are true or not. So as soon as I start typing something, it keeps firing. So it's still false because email is not valid. I'm saying wish. Okay, so still it's not valid, but as soon as I type something here, it should say true because it has value for both the fields, and then false, wish. But we also need one validation here where it should be a proper email ID. So this is what I wanted to show. Now we can also, because it's saying true false, it's giving a value. I can right away bind it with my login button, but rx dot is enabled. So is this fine? Is enabled is true. I guess this is fine. So as soon as it lands, it's a false value. Is enabled is false. I guess this is fine. So let's run and see. This is not enabled. As soon as you start entering, it gets enabled. So validation is complete right now. So let's do the final validation where I also need to see whether this email is a proper email or not. Whatever I'm entering should be a proper email ID. So let's do that. So for that, let me just define a utility function called a valid string or not within, let's say, let me go to, do I have a shared utility? Yes, I have a shared utility. I just need to create a string extension. And then that should be part of utility. String extension. I'm just gonna use a function directly. It's nothing but it just validates whether your string is an email or not. So it's using a regular expression and a predicate matches, it evaluates, sends whether it is true or not. If it is email, it sends true. So this is what I'm going to use. It's a simple usage. I'm going to go back here and I'm going to add one more check here, and $0, which is a string, is email. So if it is email, it is valid. So two conditions here. If it is not empty, as well as if it is email, so even this is not needed because we just need to see whether it is email or not. So even if you don't have this, it's gonna work. Like if it is email, map, and then see, because empty is not an email, so it's always going to give you an error. I mean, it's going to say it's not a valid email. So that's done. So let's check that once. So this is the final step of validation. After that, we go with the login part. So So that's pretty interesting. Let's check this one. It's not enabling because it's not a valid email yet. It's going to be valid now. So all the validations are complete for it to start. Pretty good, right? That's how Rx works, but even it is the same with even non-Rx, where you define outlets, actions, and then see on text change or something, or even after entering you leave a field on focus change or something, you validate your fields. If it is valid, enable your login button, or otherwise disable. But with Rx, it's very simple. You can combine different things and then map it and then create another observable or a driver out of existing drivers. So I had, at least here, I had two drivers. I converted it into a one driver and added a validation for that to enable or disable. So it's as simple as that. So this is what I wanted to cover in this episode: validation using RxSwift. And then we are going to launch the login screen, which is nothing but connecting to a WebSocket, and then we are setting up the WebSocket from there, and then start the chat features from there. So before that, we are going to set up, as soon as we log in, we are going to set up a tab screen where you're going to see or chat room screens. Right now there is nothing, so it's going to show an empty view, which is I'm going to create it as a custom control, because we are going to have an empty chat room section, empty friends section, and a profile section. Those three sections I'm going to create as part of the uh, next tutorial. So I'm coming back pretty soon, for the next ones. So until then, it's bye from me.